February 8, 1942. The air above Java hung thick, with heat and the residue of retreat. At Jakarta Airfield, amid palm shadows and the echo of engines long fallen silent, a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress serial number, 412471, stood alone in the tropical haze. Its nose was gone, its propellers twisted, but its heart, its vast, riveted body, still spoke of power. American crewmen had fled hours earlier, leaving behind not merely a machine of war, but a symbol-coded blueprint of an industrial philosophy far beyond the reach of its captors. Within days, Japanese troops advancing across the conquered airfields of Java would come upon this fortress and others like it. They had captured American planes before, wrecks scattered across Wake Island, the Philippines. Malay, but never something like this. Here lay the embodiment of America's industrial faith. A weapon built not by hands alone, but by systems precision upon precision, tolerance upon tolerance. A nation's soul expressed in aluminum. The Japanese engineers who first laid eyes on it could not yet know what they had found. To them it was a puzzle, an object to dissect and comprehend. Yet as they began to trace its rivets and wiring, they would begin to glimpse something deeper, a terrifying truth. This was not simply a bomber. It was the architecture of a civilization at war with inefficiency itself. March 1942. The conquest of the Dutch East Indies complete. Japan's technical teams arrived at the airfields of Java. At Mioen Field, a B-17E lay largely intact, missing only its nose section and engines. At Bandung, Cirebon, and Malang, others waited, damaged but recoverable. Among those who recorded the find was Taro Saito, an aviation editor for the Asahi Press. His dispatches spoke of American giants lying across the grass like fallen idols, their metallic skins reflecting the morning light as if unwilling to die. The aircraft were quickly assigned to the Koku, Gujutsu Kenkyujo, the Air Technical Research Institute, Japan's pinnacle of aeronautical study, headquartered at Tachikawa Airfield near Tokyo. When news reached the institute, its engineers moved with urgency. Teams were dispatched south, armed with measuring tools, cameras, and notebooks. They were to recover not only the planes, but the secret of how a nation could build them. For months, under a merciless equatorial sun, Japanese mechanics and captured Allied technicians worked side by side. Engines were scavenged from wrecks, hydraulic lines traced, electrical systems pieced together from fragments. Each bolt removed revealed another mystery. The systems were complex, yet the logic behind them clean, modular, almost austere was alien to Japanese design philosophy. The Americans, they realized, had not built this aircraft to be perfect. They had built it to be repeatable. By late 1942, 2 of the Java B-17s had been restored to flight condition. Another, captured in the Philippines, had already reached Japan earlier in the year. They were self-consistent machines that obeyed the geometry of their blueprints rather than the instincts of their builders. The study moved from structure to systems. Hydraulic lines gleamed under lamplight, each connector identical, every thread standardized. Electrical circuits used machine-crimped terminals, not hand-soldered joints. Even the oxygen regulators bore manufacturer marks from automobile suppliers proof that entire industries could be repurposed for war. Japan's engineers stared at these stamps in silence. It meant the American industrial base was not only vast, it was interchangeable. The deeper they looked, the more the B-17 revealed itself as an argument made of metal. Its simplicity was deceptive. Every feature served the same philosophy: reliability through standardization, speed through repetition, power through scale. When the test flights began in autumn 1943, the fortress roared again above Tokyo. Major Uno and Captain Yagi took turns at the controls, the engines shaking the morning air as the aircraft lifted over Fusa Airfield. Japanese pilots practiced intercepts, their Ki-43 and Ki-44, fighters swarming the great bomber in mock attacks. Cameras rolled as propaganda. Films showed the enemy's fortress succumbing to Japan's defenders. But the truth, whispered among pilots afterward, was more sobering. Even damaged, the bomber refused to fall easily. Its firepower was immense, its armor unyielding. Beneath the propaganda, a darker conclusion settled in the minds of the engineers and officers at Tachikawa. If Japan struggled this much to maintain one captured bomber, how many could America produce? If each of these machines could be replaced faster than Japan could destroy them, then victory was no longer a matter of valor or tactics. It was mathematics, industrial arithmetic written across continents. In 1943, Asahi Press published Anatomy of the Enemy's Aircraft. Within its pages, the B-17 occupied pride of place drawings, diagrams, and measured praise. The tone was technical, restrained. But between the lines, engineers could read the quiet dread. The aircraft was not revolutionary in design, it was revolutionary in execution. It proved that America's power lay not in genius, but in organization. As they turned its pages, Japan's engineers understood what their leaders did not. This war would not be decided in the air, but in the factory. The true battlefield was the assembly line, and there Japan was already losing. The captured fortresses at Tachikawa were supposed to yield tactical insight performance, data, aerodynamic secrets. Instead, they revealed something more profound. The B-17's genius was invisible to the eye. It lay in the uniformity of its parts, the rhythm of its production, the orchestration of thousands of workers bound by one exacting standard. When engineers at Tachikawa recorded their findings that winter, they did so with the solemnity of men witnessing a revelation. The war was no longer a contest of machines, it was a contest of systems. And America's system was winning. The fortress at Tachikawa would continue to fly for months, its engines echoing faintly over the capital it once sought to destroy. But within the hangars, under the cold precision of measurement and note-taking, Japan's engineers were beginning to see their future, not in the empire they served, but in the lessons it would leave behind. Winter, 1943. The hangars of Tachikawa stood shrouded in fog. Within, under the dim hum of floodlights, the captured B-17s rested in silence. Three metallic giants whose wings once bore the star and bar of the United States. Around them moved the quiet figures of Japan's best minds, the engineers of the Koku Gijutsu Kenkyujo. Their notes filled thousands of pages. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and paper ink. By now, the novelty had faded. The excitement of discovery was replaced by unease. Each measurement, each diagram, each flight test seemed to point toward an unavoidable truth. Japan was fighting a war it could not industrially sustain. The B-17 was no longer just a captured aircraft. It had become a mirror reflecting everything Japan lacked. Major Kazuyuki Saito's daily reports grew longer, more reflective. "It is a machine designed not for victory through ingenuity," he wrote, "but through reproduction. Every bolt, every fitting is made to be identical. It assumes infinite replacement." He knew what that meant. America's factories were the true bombers. B-17s were only their shadows. Yet the work continued. Engineers stripped one of the aircraft down to its bare framework to study stress distribution and weight ratios. Another was kept airworthy for flight trials. The third served as a systems model, allowing engineers to trace electrical circuits, control linkages, and gun synchronization. The tests were grueling. Replacement parts were impossible to source. Each bearing and hydraulic seal had to be fabricated by hand. Japanese machinists labored to reproduce components whose tolerances demanded instruments they did not possess. It was as if they were attempting to copy a symphony while missing half the notes. Still, the B-17 flew again. Test flights from Tachikawa to Hamamatsu drew crowds of curious pilots and air cadets. The bomber's four Wright Cyclones thundered across the Tokyo plains, a sound unlike any engine built in Japan. American radio frequencies were tested. Gun turrets rotated, bombing equipment calibrated. Everything worked, and yet everything felt foreign. Lieutenant Shiyama, one of the flight engineers, later wrote in his private diary, "We admire its logic, but we cannot love it. It is cold, deliberate, without soul. But perhaps that is what victory demands." By mid-1944, the Pacific tide had turned. The U.S. Army Air Forces were now striking Japan's outer defenses, trucks, Saipan, Tinian, and then in June came the weapon that eclipsed even the B-17, the B-29, Super Fortress. At Tachikawa, the engineers watched newsreels of these enormous bombers and understood immediately everything they had learned. From the B-17 was now obsolete. America had moved forward again by a generation. The fortress at Tachikawa became an instructor of sorts. a silent teacher for the defense planners of Tokyo, fighter, squadrons trained against it. Learning interception angles and gunnery ranges, the Imperial Navy borrowed it for comparison against their own G-4M Betty bombers. Reports circulated through the highest levels of the Army Air Technical Bureau. If the B-29 is built with the same precision as the B-17, interception will be nearly impossible. By the autumn of 1944, the first American raids reached the Japanese mainland. Tokyo burned under the glow of B-29 firestorms. At Tachikawa, the engineers worked through the nights as distant air raid sirens wailed. The irony was unbearable. The very aircraft that had once been their subject of study was now returning, in greater form to destroy the empire that had dissected it. In March 1945, as B-29s obliterated Tokyo in the largest single air raid of the war, the hangars at Tachikawa were hit. The first explosion tore through the fuel depot. The second collapsed the main roof. When dawn came, the once gleaming B-17 lay in ruins, its fuselage torn open, wings half melted. The engineers stood among the smoke and ash, silent. The fortress had finally fallen, not to enemy fire, but to the fire of its own kind. A handful of components survived the upper turret, the control yoke, fragments of the landing gear. They were crated and sent to Nagoya for study, but the war was ending. Fuel was scarce, electricity rationed, morale gone. The engineers who had once admired the fortress now hid their notebooks. Fearful of invasion, August 1945. The empire surrendered. The hangars at Tachikawa were silent once more. American occupation troops soon arrived, curious to see what had become of their lost aircraft. Among the ruins, they found fragments of B-17 serials stenciled, faintly beneath layers of Japanese paint. They found files of measurements, photographs, and technical sketches, all meticulously organized, all labeled in Japanese. It was as if the engineers had tried to preserve the memory of their discovery, even in defeat. When U.S. intelligence officers reviewed the documents, they were astonished by their thoroughness. Every dimension, every system, every tolerance had been recorded. But what moved them most were the notes in the margin small, almost poetic observations written in careful brush strokes. This is how they build nations. The machine reflects its people. Our future must be built this way, or we will have no future. After the war, many of the same engineers who had studied the fortress found themselves rebuilding Japan's aviation industry under American supervision. They had learned that precision could be mass-produced, that reliability was not born of genius, but of discipline. The post-war Japanese manufacturing miracle Toyota's production system, Nikon's optical assembly lines, even Sony's micro-tolerance, circuitry all echoed lessons first glimpsed inside a dismantled American bomber. In the early 1950s, as Japan's air industry cautiously revived under U.S. supervision, a handful of surviving engineers were quietly invited to work with the newly formed Japan Air Self-Defense Force. Some of them, now middle-aged men with fading wartime memories, helped maintain the first American-supplied aircraft C-46 Commandos, F-86 Sabres, and B-25 Mitchells. When they opened those machines, they saw the same language of design they had once studied at Tachikawa: interchangeability, efficiency, order. Major, now engineer, Kazuyuki Saito visited Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in 1954 as part of an industrial exchange program. In the archives, an American officer showed him a copy of the Tachikawa B-17 study. Saito recognized his own handwriting on one of the diagrams. He smiled, then bowed slightly. "You preserved it," he said. Then perhaps the war was not entirely waste. In the decades that followed, the physical remains of the captured fortresses vanished, their metal melted for reconstruction, their engines scrapped for parts. Only fragments, landing gear sections, control columns, pieces of fuselage skin remained in obscure collections. A small fragment, reportedly from one of the Java aircraft, was displayed for a time at the Tokorozawa Aviation Memorial. Most visitors passed it by without notice. But in aerospace universities across Japan, Nagoya, Tokyo, Osaka, the story of the Tachikawa B-17 lived on as quiet legend. Professors would speak of it not as an act of war, but as a moment of awakening, the day Japan first looked directly into the mirror of American industrial power. and saw its reflection not as an enemy, but as a teacher. In 1962, an American historian named John C. Elliott interviewed several surviving engineers from the wartime research team. One of them, now elderly, said, "When we opened that bomber, we did not only find metal. We found the secret to a nation's confidence. Every part fit, because every worker trusted the process that built it." Half a century later, in a world of jetliners and microchips, the lessons of the fortress endure. The B-17 no longer flies over Tokyo, yet its spirit, its precision, its order, its quiet faith in production, as power can still be heard in the rhythmic hum of every factory floor from Nagoya to Seattle. In the end, the story of the captured B-17s is not a tale of victory or defeat. It is the story of understanding, of how one nation's mastery of production revealed to another the blueprint of its future. The bombers of Java are gone, their wings lost to time, but their echoes remain in the silence between machines, in the discipline of every engineer who still believes that their journey northward required elaborate coordination. The aircraft, still bearing the enemy's markings, would cross thousands of miles of conquered territory under armed escort. Orders were sent to every air defense unit along the route: do not fire. These are our prizes. The first flight from Java to Tokyo became an aerial pilgrimage. Nakajima Ltd. transport Japan's own licensed version of the Douglas. DC-3 escorted the two massive bombers northward. They passed over Singapore, Formosa, Okinawa, silent witnesses to an empire at its height. By May 1943, the fortresses arrived at Tachikawa, joining their Philippine counterpart. Three American giants now stood beneath the rising sun. Major Kazuyuki Saito, an aeronautical engineer of rare intellect and methodical temperament, was assigned to lead the examination. His team lieutenants, Shiyama, Kurusu, and Ohara, approached the project not as soldiers, but as scientists dissecting a new species. Each morning, beneath the muted light of hangar lamps, they began again, measuring, tracing, documenting. Panels removed one by one, rivets counted, spacings recorded, tolerances compared. What they found stunned them. Across all three captured aircraft built in different factories, at different times each measurement matched. Rivet holes aligned with mathematical precision. Structural panels, when swapped between aircraft, fit perfectly. No craftsman's hand could have achieved such consistency. These machines had not been built. They had been produced. To Japanese engineers raised in a tradition of artisanal construction, this realization was almost spiritual. Their own aircraft were works of craftsmanship, each one slightly unique, dependent on the judgment of skilled men with files and gauges. But the B-17 spoke of something colder and far more powerful: standardization. The aircraft had been born not of artistry, but of organization. Every inch of its structure was a promise that precision could be achieved not through skill, but through process. They disassembled the Wright R-1820. Cyclone engines next, the heart of the fortress. Each piston, each connecting rod, each valve stem was measured. The results defied belief. The tolerances thousandths of an inch matched exactly from one engine to the next. Cylinders could be exchanged without fitting. Crankshafts swapped without adjustment. The manuals confirmed it. Field mechanics were expected to replace major components without alteration. This was production as mathematics, not craftsmanship. And it carried within it an unspoken message. The United States could build and maintain these machines anywhere using anyone, because precision had been designed into the tools themselves. In contrast, Japanese aircraft required the patient attention of craftsmen. Fittings were hand-adjusted, parts modified to match each unique airframe. The system was elegant but fragile. Every replacement demanded experience. Every repair, skill. America's bombers needed neither. The lessons they had learned at Tachikawa would quietly shape the nation's post-war manufacturing philosophy. Standardization, quality control, process discipline, these would become the foundations of Japan's industrial resurrection. In the 1950s, Major Saitanow, an engineer for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, was asked what he remembered most about the captured B-17. He paused and said simply, "It was not a bomber we studied. It was a civilization. The fortress that had once stood under the rising sun was gone, melted into history. But its legacy endured not in wreckage or metal, but in the transformation it inspired. In the decades to come, Japanese factories would produce machines of their own cameras, cars, aircraft crafted with a precision once unimaginable. The B-17s captured on the fields of Java had revealed the secret of American power, but in that revelation lay the seed of Japan's rebirth. From the ashes of one empire rose another built not on conquest, but on perfection of process. The fortress had completed its final mission. In war, but in understanding, the war had ended. But the shadows it cast lingered across the wrecked landscape of Japan. Factories lay silent, railways torn, airfields abandoned. Yet in a few forgotten hangars, Tachikawa, Hamamatsu, Kagamigahara, dust-covered crates still remained. Inside were drawings, photographs, and fragments of a foreign bomber that once ruled the skies. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. In 1946, U.S. occupation forces began cataloging captured military technology. Teams from the Army Air Force's Technical Intelligence Division visited former research centers across Japan, gathering whatever the war had left behind. At Tachikawa, among stacks of ash-stained documents, they found the complete study of the B-17 Project 2 bound volumes, hand-drawn in ink, labeled simply Kenkyu Daisan. Research number 3. The Americans flipped through the pages in silence. The measurements were exact, the observations meticulous. In some places, Japanese annotations compared U.S. tolerances with those of the Nakajima, Kai-49 and Mitsubishi, G4M. But what caught their attention were the conclusions, philosophical, almost reverent. "This system is not the work of craftsmen," one line read. "It is the expression of an industrial culture." Those documents were shipped to Wright Field in Ohio, where U.S. analysts translated and archived them. Few outside the intelligence community ever saw them, but among engineers, they became an extraordinary case study, a mirror image of one nation's technology seen through the eyes of another. Meanwhile, in Japan, the engineers who had once studied the fortress were starting over. The old Koku Gijutsu Kenkyujo had been dissolved. Its scientists